We often hear about political figures facing legal trouble, but it's really the details, the specifics and the consequences that capture our attention.
Definitely.
Today, we're diving deep into the sentencing of former Congressman George Santos.
It's quite the story.
And we've got a really interesting mix of sources for this one. Everything from breaking news in Newsday and AP,
Right.
A look at the human side from people.com, some MSNBC commentary via a YouTube transcript, even a Reddit thread discussing it.
And that defense sentencing memo, which is key.
Exactly. Crucially, the defense's own arguments filed with the court. So our mission here is to really cut through the noise, understand the core elements, the arguments made at sentencing, and, well, what the final outcome tells us.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we start?
Well, I think the core of it is what he actually admitted to, right? Santos pleaded guilty. Wire fraud was one count tied to that party program scheme.
Ah, yes, the party program scheme. That was about faking the campaign fundraising numbers.
Exactly. Numbers submitted to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. The idea was to, look better funded than he was.
To get support from the National Republican Congressional Committee, the NRCC.
Precisely. And the other guilty plea was for aggravated identity theft.
Which came from using real people's names as contributors, but without their permission.
That's it. Unauthorized use of contributor names.
Right. And it's striking because even beyond those main charges he pleaded guilty to, back in August 2024?
August 19th? Okay.
Even beyond that, he stipulated to a whole lot of other alleged misconduct.
Yeah, that came out too. Things like access device fraud, basically credit card stuff.
Right.
More wire fraud, this time linked to a company called Redstone Strategies, LLC.
Okay.
And even accusations of theft of public money on employment benefits fraud, apparently while he was employed.
Wow. And false statements, too, on his official House financial disclosures.
Yep. All part of the picture he accepted responsibility for. It really paints, a pattern.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
So all of this led up to the sentencing, which was just yesterday.
Just yesterday, Friday, April 25th, 2025, U.S. District Judge Joanna Seibert down in central Islip, New York.
And the sentence itself.
Pretty significant. 87 months?
87 months. That's over 7 years in federal prison.
Over 7 years, yeah.
And reading the news reports, it sounds like Judge Seibert was, not holding back.
No, definitely not. Newsday, people.com, they all reported her comments, called Santos an arrogant fraudster.
And said he engaged in flagrant thievery. Strong words.
Very strong. It shows a pretty clear judicial reaction to the whole case.
What else stood out from her remarks?
For me, it was her focus on remorse. Or the lack of it. She apparently asked him directly, "Where is your remorse? Where do I see it?"
Implying she didn't see any.
Seemed that way. She added, "It's always someone else's fault."
That really suggests she wasn't buying his expressions of regret.
Even though he reportedly cried during sentencing and offered apologies. Right. He did offer apologies, said he was humbled, apologized for betraying constituent confidence. But the judge's repeated questions about remorse, it seems like that was a huge factor for her.
It really highlights something, doesn't it? That in these white-collar cases, demonstrating genuine remorse can be almost as critical as the legal arguments.
Absolutely. It's about the judge's assessment of character, of taking responsibility, not just the crime itself.
But here's a slightly strange twist. Even with that strong condemnation, Newsday quoted her acknowledging something else about him.
Oh, what was that?
She apparently called him a brilliant person. Forget the lack of education.
Huh. That is an interesting contrast.
Right. Recognizing intelligence while simultaneously condemning the actions so forcefully.
Well, it speaks to that idea that intelligence doesn't stop crime, maybe even enables more complex fraud sometimes, perhaps a sense of wasted potential,
Could be. That someone so capable chose that path.
A path of, as she put it, flagrant thievery.
Okay, so that's the sentence and the judge's view. What about the defense? What were they arguing for?
Well, we get insight from their sentencing memorandum. They were pushing for a much lighter sentence.
How much lighter?
They requested just 24 months, 2 years for the aggravated identity theft count, and only probation for the wire fraud count.
Wow, that's a world away from the 87 months he received.
A massive difference. They were arguing for what's called a variance from the advisory guidelines range.
Okay, so the Presentence Investigation Report, the PSR, probably recommended a higher range.
Exactly. The PSR suggested 75 to 87 months. The defense wanted the judge to go way below that.
And what were their main arguments for such a big reduction?
One key point was challenging the organizer or leader enhancement. That's something that can bump up the sentence recommendation.
Okay.
They argued that Santos's campaign treasurer, Nancy Marks, actually played an equal, maybe even bigger role in the fraud.
How so?
They pointed out she was the one physically submitting the false reports to the FEC, certifying they were accurate. They suggested it was more of a shared plan, not just Santos directing everything.
That makes sense. If multiple people are involved, it muddies the water on who the leader is. Did they have evidence for that?
Their memo mentioned government disclosures that apparently supported Marks having significant involvement.
Interesting. What else did the defense bring up?
They went into mitigating factors in his personal history, trying to humanize him, provide context.
Like what?
Described a challenging childhood, mentioned his father having high drinking proclivities, his mother gambling frequently, said it disrupted his education, led to bullying.
Oh, okay. Trying to show hardship early on.
Right. And they also really emphasized his current role supporting his sister and her daughter.
His niece.
Yeah, who apparently has severe autism and ADHD. They argued his incarceration would cause extreme hardship for them, financially and emotionally.
It's a tough point. It reminds you that these cases always have ripple effects on families. Doesn't excuse the crime, but adds complexity.
Definitely. They also mentioned his own health issues, chronic back pain, respiratory problems.
And mental health.
Yes, a history of depression, even suicidal thoughts. Mentioned a past voluntary psychiatric hold, apparently around the time his mother was diagnosed with cancer and passed away.
So a wide range of personal mitigating factors presented.
They really covered a lot. They also tried to downplay the seriousness of that wire fraud linked to the NRCC.
How do they argue that?
They said the guideline range was inflated because of the supposed loss amount to the NRCC. Their argument was kind of, well, maybe that fake donor report in 2021, maybe it was a misguided effort that wasn't even strictly necessary to get the NRCC support anyway.
Sort of minimizing the impact of that specific fraud.
A bit, yeah. Trying to argue the calculation was too harsh.
Okay. And wasn't there something about cooperation?
Yes. This was fascinating. The defense memo highlighted that Santos had cooperated in a totally separate federal investigation.
Separate from his own case?
Completely. Apparently, he reported an attempted bribery scheme against him.
Seriously?
Yeah. And his report and cooperation led to the arrest and charges against someone else, a Hector Medina Jr.
Wow. That seems like a pretty significant point in his favor. Suggests he's willing to work with law enforcement sometimes.
You'd think so. It certainly paints a more complex picture than just arrogant fraudster.
But obviously the prosecution saw things very differently.
Oh, absolutely. They had strong arguments for that full 87-month sentence.
What was their main thrust?
Deterrence. They argued his conduct demanded a substantial deterrent sentence, and they definitely weren't buying the remorse angle either.
What evidence did they use for that?
His own social media posts, apparently. They pointed to posts where he was critical of the prosecutors as proof he wasn't genuinely sorry.
Ouch. Using his own words against him.
Exactly. The U.S. attorney, John Durham, flat out said those unrepentant posts proved he deserved a significant sentence. It really feels like his online persona came back to bite him.
So his public statements undermined any private expressions of remorse he might have made in court.
It certainly seems the prosecution framed it that way. They argued he'd made a mockery of the U.S. election system.
How?
Through the whole fabricated biography, the lies about his background, and stealing from donors.
And they highlighted the victims too, didn't they?
Yes, they made sure to mention that victims included vulnerable people, a woman with brain damage, 2 elderly men, really emphasizing the human cost.
And that unemployment benefits issue came up again.
Big time. They stressed the hypocrisy, collecting benefits while employed, and then later, as a congressman, cost-sponsoring legislation against that very kind of fraud.
It's a powerful contrast to draw for a judge, acting above the law while condemning the same behavior publicly.
It really underscores their argument about his character and lack of respect for the system.
So financial penalties were also part of this. Restitution.
Yes. As part of the plea deal, he agreed to pay $373,000 in restitution back to victims. And he also agreed to forfeit another $205,000. So significant financial consequences on top of the prison time.
Now, this might be unbelievable, but didn't he try to stay in the public eye after pleading guilty?
It's kind of wild, right? He started a podcast called Pants on Fire with George Santos.
You can't make this stuff up. Pants on fire.
Seriously. And he was reportedly trying to get commissions on Cameo, even OnlyFans, supposedly, to pay legal fees.
Wow. And he became a columnist, too.
Yeah, a political columnist for the South Shore Press. It's like he was leaning into the notoriety.
Which you could argue probably didn't help the prosecution's point about him lacking remorse.
You could definitely argue that. Launching a podcast called Pants on Fire while facing sentencing for fraud. It could be seen as, well, thumbing his nose at the seriousness of it all.
Did the defense mention anything else, like prison safety?
Yeah, the memo apparently mentioned he was hoping for protective custody. So there's an awareness, it seems, of potential risks he might face while incarcerated.
Okay, one more thing from the defense memo. Didn't they try to compare his case to others?
Yes, standard tactic. They listed several other cases, white-collar crimes, political fraud where the sentences were much lower.
Examples.
Things like mail fraud involving millions but getting only a few months, FEC fraud getting 12 months, PAIC fraud, donor fraud cases, losses from thousands up to $14 million, but sentences often in the range of a few months to maybe 2 or 3 years.
So trying to show the 87 months was out of line compared to precedents.
Exactly. They even listed former U.S. representatives like Jesse L. Jackson Jr., Michael Grimm, Chris Collins, Duncan Hunter. Several others, state-level politicians, too, who often receive sentences below the guideline recommendations for various offenses.
Trying to establish a pattern of leniency that wasn't being applied to Santos.
That was the goal. Show his proposed sentence was disproportionately harsh.
But ultimately, Judge Seibert wasn't persuaded by those comparisons or the mitigating factors.
Clearly not. She sided with the prosecution's view and imposed that full 87-month sentence, over 7 years, for the wire fraud and aggravated identity theft.
It's just a dramatic end, isn't it? For someone representing parts of Long Island and Queens in the U.S. Congress just a short while ago.
A very dramatic fall.
So when you look at these competing arguments, the defense pushing personal history, cooperation, comparisons, versus the prosecution hitting hard on the brazenness, the victims, the lack of remorse, it really brings us back, doesn't it?
It does. Back to those core questions about what drives these sentencing outcomes, especially for public figures.
The defense emphasizes challenges, cooperation attempts, sentences in similar cases, trying to get leniency.
While the prosecution and ultimately the judge focus squarely on the severity of the crimes, the impact on victims, and that perceived lack of genuine remorse.
And here's maybe the aha moment, that stark contrast, the defense asking for 2 years, maybe probation.
And he gets over 7 years.
That massive gap. It's jarring. It really forces you to think about all the invisible factors, the judge's discretion, the weight given to remorse versus, say, difficult upbringing or cooperation in another case.
Especially in white-collar crime involving public trust.
It definitely does. And it leaves you, the listener, with a big question to chew on. What's the right balance between punishment, deterring others, and maybe even rehabilitation when someone in public office violates trust so fundamentally?
What kind of message does this sentence send about how seriously the courts take deception that undermines the electoral process itself?
Yeah, what does this say about the judiciary's view on political integrity? Definitely something to mull over long after we wrap up this deep dive today.